I'm sick and fed up of men, and male victims in particular, being treated like dysfunctional women. It's not toxic masculinity. We just don't have the healing processes that are applicable to men. We're the ones in the wrong, not them.
Hello, and I'm here with Deborah Powney, and I am Josh, and you are a lecturer in Policing and Criminology at the University of Central Lancashire. That's right?
That is correct, yeah.
Just double checking.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you've specialised in interpartner violence in particular. Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about your background? I think it probably pays to have you say it yourself, although I have done my research, don't worry.
Yeah, absolutely. I came into the field of psychology at supposedly as a midlife crisis, I imagine. It actually came from something quite profound for most people. My father died, and I'd got remarried. I'll tell you a bit more about my first marriage in a second. And I was at a stage in my life where suddenly one reflects on the meaning of life and what you're doing with your life. And my husband, John, who's a drummer, asked me two questions that are simple yet profound. He asked me what I'd always wanted to do with my life. And I said psychology. I'd always planned to go back to university after my undergrad and do psychology. And then his second question was, so what's stopping you? And the answer was nothing. So I enrolled for a master's degree at UCLan, University of Central Lancashire, with a bit of questioning about that I wanted to understand about myself, because my first marriage was very abusive, and it didn't cease after I got divorced. I got my divorce relatively quickly, within 9 months. But I was actually dragged through court for more years than I was married. At the time, we were just coming to the end of legal aid as it was. And because my ex-husband wasn't working, he got access to legal aid, but I was working and I didn't. So he was able to use the system to get me in and out of court really often. So often that halfway through, so 3 years into the almost 6 years I was in and out of court, I became a litigant in person purely out of financial reasons, and learned all the ins and outs that you needed to get yourself through the court system, which is horrific for anyone that's in there. But as part of, I suppose, my adaptation to what I'd been through, I was very open and honest with my employer, my friends, family, and, to be honest, anyone that would listen. And from my experience, as many men were talking to me about their experience of domestic abuse, as were women. And to be honest, I'd prior to going back in psychology, I was in industry, and my first part of my career was in a predominantly male-dominated industry in brewing. And I'd always had great relationships with my work colleagues, great relationships with my father, my brother, family. Up until the point of my first marriage, I'd never really had this, I suppose, a patriarchal backed notion of being an oppressed woman. So when I went into to do my master's, one of the things I was looking at was obviously my experience in the literature, and I couldn't find anything that sat comfortably with me. I was educated. I came from a very stable background. I never saw myself as being oppressed. I was successful financially. So I didn't sort of fit this template of what the literature was telling me of this broken, weak, vulnerable, oppressed woman. And then beyond that, I couldn't really find anything that spoke about male victims. So I was very fortunate that my supervisor for my master's was very open and honest about the literature and the narrative. but introduced me to Professor Graham Kevin, who became my supervisor for my PhD. And she's dedicated her career to studying aggression as a general field, but has a particular interest in male victims. So completed my master's, decided to go on and do a PhD, and she started gently nudging me to the literature that led me to specialize in male victims, although I do cover male and female victims in my research, and LGBTQ plus and elder victims, child to parent abuse, the whole gambit.
Mm-hmm. And I found what the work you've done quite interesting, because it seems to me to contrast from what I've seen of the literature elsewhere, in that it seems like you come at it without any preconceived notion of what the outcome might be, which is what I would like to think is the proper way of going about it. Whereas some of the literature I've read seems to have the presumptions normally informed by more radical feminist ideology that cannot be questioned, and therefore the research and the practices that are employed there is shaped around proving this presumption, as opposed to going in there with an open mind and seeing what you get out at the end.
Yeah, which is kind of flies in the face of everything I hold dear in using scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
No one's completely objective, but we do have tools to try to eradicate as much bias as is possible, and still remain a human with particular ideas. So I suppose if I had to describe my research standpoint, I describe myself as an empirical pragmatist. So what that means is that I base my view on evidence, on the evidence that we can gather. And then I want that evidence not to just sit on the dusty annals of a library in academia. I want it to be practical. I want it to be out there, and I want it to be used for a beneficial outcome. So one of the things, we did a couple of surveys in lockdown, and that came, they were actually born of COVID, I always say, because we had a study ready to go for male victims, and it involved men coming together as a group. And of course, when we went to lockdown, no one was allowed out, so we couldn't do that. So my first survey, I scrawled out literally as soon as we got the lockdown announcement. And what I wanted to look at, because previous to that, I'd done a study on female victims, and as part of my PhD, I look at adaptation and positive adaptation. Like I said, I don't think any victim is permanently broken. And if they are, there are ways that you can positively adapt out of that.
Of course, yeah.
So what I wanted to track was the types and levels of abuse that men were sustaining, what coping methods they might engage to adapt to that. Was there any post-traumatic distress levels that come from the abuse they've sustained? And what's the opportunity for what we label post-traumatic growth? So I put 4 scales in, and then the sort of curiosity in me thought, well, if they're all locked in a room, they might stay on for some more questions. So I also included around 40 open and closed questions where they could actually put in their experience. And that gave us huge amounts of prospects for how we analyze the data, how we cut it, what reports that we use. But a lot of the questions and that particular path and the scales I used to measure that came from the literature that you're alluding to, which gives us what I label myths. It starts off with men are not abused, particularly not abused by women. So I was asking those questions. That men don't have to cope with these things because it doesn't really affect them, even if it does happen. And then there's also these myths around men don't get afraid. And even if they do get afraid, it's only temporary and it doesn't have any long lasting effect. So what I found, and we found in the analysis of that is still ongoing, was that men were sustaining very similar types and levels of abuse as female victims. They were afraid of not necessarily the woman that was being abusive towards them, but the way it manifested in male victims was they were afraid of the consequences. So either themselves being harmed physically or psychologically, and really predominantly any children being harmed. So that myth was blown out of the water. And then we used something to measure post-traumatic distress called the impact of event scale. And that gives us indicators of if the experiences might lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. And it has really firm cutoff points. And the reason I use that scale is it's been used over a variety of traumas, war, disease, natural disasters, all sorts of things. So it's very robust, and it's been used over a long time as well. Mm-hmm. So it's valid and it's reliable. It measures what it says it measures, and it does it consistently over time. And again, as a researcher, that's really important to have those kind of scales that you're using. Mm-hmm. And what we found is that almost 8 out of 10, so almost 80% of men that answered this survey were at clinical levels of post-traumatic distress.
So
and
that's massive, isn't it,
it's
really?
Huge. It's
particularly coming from
huge.
the position where it's almost assumed that this doesn't happen at all. Well, 8 out of 10 that really flies in the face of it quite resoundingly.
And this was initially, when I launched this, I thought we'd probably get a couple of hundred men from the UK if I was lucky. And we only had 3 weeks to turn this around. And I got over 1,300. It was 1,347.
Wow, that's a massive sample.
It is for research of this time. Mm-hmm. And we had a large cohort in the UK, a large cohort in Australia, and the biggest cohort was from India.
Oh, really?
So that gave us really good views on not just across continents between the UK and Australia, but really contrasts across culture. So we could really take a look at those things. But going back to the post-traumatic distress, we got 80% that were of clinical levels that might go on and develop post-traumatic stress disorder. But 43% of the entire group were at levels so high that it could affect their immune system for up to 10 years after the event. So
I didn't even realise that was an effect of it.
Yeah,
wow.
Post-traumatic distresses can have physiological effects. Mm-hmm. So they can lead not only to any kind of mental health issues, but also impact on your immune system, impact on your heart, blood pressure, all the things that are associated that we're told to avoid, like the proverbial, by doctors.
And I imagine that's through stress, isn't it? Because stress suppresses the immune system, but I'm very surprised that it would affect them for up to 10 years. I would have thought that it might be perhaps short term, maybe a year at most, but no, that's really surprising.
Well, the other thing about domestic abuse and coercive control, because we mix the questions up in that, and in the second survey, it was just predominantly, it was just totally coercive control. And the reason being that when you look at the other events that are measured by this scale, they tend to have two things in common. They are short-lived. So if it's a natural disaster, it tends to be short-lived. It tends to be not somebody that you live with. So it's perpetrated by someone else, or it's something that is absolutely nothing to do with people. It's a disease or it's a natural disaster. The difference with domestic abuse and coercive control is you are essentially trapped And this is someone that you trust, and it's 24/7.
Yeah.
This is not something that is a one-off natural disaster or a war that isn't particularly aimed at you. But with domestic abuse, it really is.
I suppose it's very personal, isn't it? And it also probably affects the way in which you form relationships with other people in general. Because if someone who supposedly cares about you is acting abusively towards you, then that's going to kind of warp your worldview, almost to damage the other relationships in your life, I would imagine, at the very least.
And with yourself.
Of course, yeah.
How do you trust yourself if you're making a decision about your life partner, and then you find out, well, how can I trust my own view? And that's before we start going into gaslighting and all the various elements that are wrapped up with psychological abuse, what we call coercive control. But one of the things I'd like to point out about our research, and I know we'll talk about this later on, is there's something called the Duluth model, which is which was developed by a group of feminist scholars and back in the 80s, 90s. And this was it was developed by talking to female domestic abuse survivors. So it took their experiences and then made this wheel. And this wheel is absolutely dominant. It's so dominant that it still appears in our Domestic Abuse Act framework guidance. So it's still very much dominant in the narrative.
From what I read in the research I did, it seems like this model is perhaps the dominant one both in the United States and in the UK. At least that's what I've read. I don't know enough about it. Really.
Absolutely, okay. You're absolutely correct on that. And I've critiqued it, as have many other people. But the interesting thing is that one of the creators actually critiqued her own model, especially when she was saying that she'd interviewed male perpetrators.
That's Ellen Pence, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I've got the. Oh, sorry.
You've got the actual quote.
I do, yeah. Would you like me to read it out, or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I can't remember it verbatim.
Okay. She said, by determining that the need or desire for power was the motivating force behind battering, we created a conceptual framework that, in fact, did not fit the lived experience of many of the men and women that we were working with. The DAIP staff remained undaunted by the difference in our theory and the actual experiences of those we were working with. It was the cases themselves that created the chink in each of our theoretical suits of armour. Speaking for myself, I found that many of the men I interviewed did not seem to articulate a desire for power over their partner, although I relentlessly took every opportunity to point to men in the group that were so motivated and merely in denial. The fact that few men ever articulated such a desire went unnoticed by me and many of my co-workers. Eventually, we realised that we were finding what we had already predetermined to find.
Yes, predeterminism, otherwise known as dogma. But it's one of those things that, despite all its flaws, because it was adopted, it is just continued. It's almost as if they've gone so far down the track with it that they can't actually step away from it, because it upholds all the actions that we see throughout every single part of any organisation that's involved with this, be it frontline people, the criminal justice system, the acts and how they are written and how they are executed. It is absolutely insidious in everything that we do.
This is definitely a phenomenon that happens in lots of different organisations, looking at things completely unrelated to this, where the presumptions of the framework are sort of disproved. However, they carry on almost regardless, because they're so far along with the direction that they've been going in that it would mean potentially having to relearn how to practice or completely restructure an entire area of development, which is a monumental undertaking. And you can understand why people would be hesitant to do so, even if the truth lies elsewhere.
Yeah, I find it quite alien, actually, because in a previous life, when I was in industry, we would try various strategies in business to gain profit and reputation and all the rest of it. But we would also analyze it. And if it wasn't failing, if it wasn't doing what we wanted it to do, we would write it off and say, okay, that's failed. Hands up, we had a go. It's not particularly great. It's not actually doing what we wanted it to do. Let's sit down and not do that again and actually find something that works. And the bizarre thing is whilst that model was created, around the same time that the women's movement brought domestic abuse to the fore, there was also researchers, feminist researchers, going out and finding that men were victimized in similar ways and at similar rates to female victims. But they were absolutely hounded out of academia, to the point Erin Pitsey, who opened the first domestic abuse shelter ever in the world, I'm happy to say is a friend of mine, was a feminist, and she had a house full of female victims, and 62% of them said they were as, if not more violent than the partners they left. And because she said that, she got hounded out, and to the point where her mail was checked because she'd received bomb threats and all sorts of things coming through the post.
Awful.
It is awful. But this information has been available to us for the same amount of time that we've had the narrative that this is something that happens to women and is perpetrated by men. But this information has been either dismissed, completely ignored, or utterly denied. And it's fascinating to me that the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case has really opened the floodgates here. And for the first time ever, we've had a bird's eye view of what actually happens in these situations in a court. And it was, I work on two screens, and I had the case running as I was working on my screens, and just constantly listening to it, thinking, I've got hundreds of men that have said the same thing on that particular instance. I've got further hundreds of men that have said this, that they're experiencing the same thing time and time again. So it doesn't matter if you're a famous film star or if you're ordinary Joe going about their lives. The experiences are identical throughout. So the second survey that we did was focusing completely on coercive control for two reasons. One, we just had the domestic abuse bill had got royal assent, and they were looking at the Coercive Control Act as well. And there was no UK data on male victims of coercive control. And also we were kind of riding the wave of the success from the first survey. So this time, the core of the items that we've used is a scale that was developed by Professor Nicola Graham-Kevin in her PhD. And one of the things the family inclusive researchers in this field are very aware of is that if they can't attack the data, they will attack the instrument. And this is when our research is getting dismissed or ignored or denied or just pushed aside. So what Nikki did when she was writing her PhD was she took items from the Duluth model and made them genderless. She made them completely gender neutral, because the Duluth model is very much he does this and she sustains that. It's set up to just, that's the only model of domestic abuse. So in that, Nikki had developed 24 items. And then from our first survey, we added another 21 items that were all the information that men had said to us about the things that they had experienced in an abusive relationship. And that was only 3 weeks again. I think it was either 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks. We went out with that, and we got over 2,000 participants this time. And again, I'm really comfortable being able to sit here and say male victims experience domestic abuse and coercive control in very similar ways and at very similar levels to women, with the exception of 3 areas that I'll come on to. But the reason I'm able to say that is that we have used items from the Duluth model that has been used in research on female victims for decades. So rather than trying to invent something that they could attack and say it's not reliable, it's not valid, it's not been tested, it can't be comparable to female victims, we used their own model and just developed it so it was gender neutral. And it showed us the high levels of coercive control that men are sustaining. And again, some of the myths around male victims is that they don't experience economic abuse, because in patriarchal theory, men have all the power and money and women don't. That's not what we found. We found over half the men in this survey and over 70% of men in the first survey had their earnings utterly controlled, completely controlled, to the point where there's various experiences that stay with you when you read this data. And one experience from a man told me that his wife had the banking app on his phone. You know, the ones where they tell you every single transaction that comes out your bank account. I switched mine off because it was just driving me bonkers. It's just, I'm spending too much money. But that was used against him. And the detail he had given me was that he'd go to work, just like everyone does, and he would go to, and he actually said he went to Pret to get a sandwich and a coffee, just nothing extraordinary, just a sandwich and a coffee. And that would ping his wife because he didn't have any access to cash. He would just use his phone, and then it would tell her exactly what he'd spent and where he had spent it. And then when he got home at night, she would absolutely just go into a circular argument on and on and on and on. So he would get no sleep at that night, go to work the next day absolutely exhausted, not being able to perform at his job. Obviously, that was noticed by colleagues and his boss, and then he would get chastised for that. So what he ended up doing is what I've labeled compelled compliance. And this is when a victim is trying to avoid the abuse by actually controlling their own behavior. So he just stopped eating when he went to work. And he said, I only ate what I was allowed to eat when she allowed me to eat it. And as a consequence of that, he was starving. He was actually starving. He had lost 20 kilos, and then his family started to notice. And then his partner had cut off any contact with his family. And it was just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So this is just a normal bloke going around his business. This is nothing extraordinary, but his life was so controlled. And if he wasn't controlled, it was so abusive that he ended up controlling himself. So this notion that men have access to all the money and they don't experience economic abuse, quite frankly, is bullshit. The other two elements were legal and administrative abuse. Anyone that's on any kind of social media that hears this narrative is women are absolutely ignored in courts. Women are absolutely chastised in courts, and we always believe the man. Again, sorry to use the same word, but it is bullshit. The system is set up to protect women. Absolutely, now, as a female that's experienced abuse, I don't think courts are the best place to actually test this anyway. But I also know the support I got with having an IDFA being able to be in the room with me, having screens set up. I was never questioned when I asked for those things. It was always offered to me as a service. And quite rightly, I was in that situation. But women that abuse men and coercively control men know that the system is stacked to help them, and they use it. We've seen it in the Johnny Depp Amber Heard case. Yeah. Believe women is absolute, utter nonsense. And it's not just nonsense for male victims and men and children. It's nonsense for women. I don't want to be given a pass because I'm a woman. I want to be able to present my evidence and present my story and be believed because I am legitimate, as it were, not a real victim, because I hate that phrase, but my experience is legitimate. but legal and administrative abuse was used against men, not just post-relationship, but as an ongoing threat throughout the abusive relationship. The third element that was really pertinent for male victims is no surprise to anyone. It's the manipulation of children.
I was just about to say that that's normally something that's held over men to make them compliant, because of course, isn't it something like 80% of custody around that sort of figure is offered exclusively towards the woman in the relationship.
And 92% of applications for contact in the UK courts are from men. Mm-hmm. So we have this societal norm that says if anything happens in a family breakdown, the man leaves, which again, he still has to pay for the mortgage and the children and everything else. He could be homeless, which does happen often, or be sofa surfing, or have to go and live in someone's back bedroom. Where with children, there was a number of issues for male victims. And this is where a lot of their fear came from when I said that this issue that men don't feel fear. They feel fear on a number of levels, and this was a real dominant one. One was to lose the relationship with their children, because again, the societal norm says you have to leave the house and it will stay with mother. The second one was mother's abusive. So if dad's not there to protect them, is that going to rain down on the children? Is she going to take out the abuse instead of on him? Is it going to be on the children? And the third one was the threats against the father that he was abusing the children in some way. So they were threatening, if you don't do this, I will tell social services you're doing X, Y, and Z. And some really horrific things that you would think, how could you even say that? And put your children in that situation that they would have to answer questions about sexual abuse or various elements of that. So children were used significantly. So men are not only experiencing the same levels of abuse and similar types of abuse as female victims, but they've also got these three factors that are utterly denied, but they are absolutely dominant in their system of abuse.
That's really quite horrifying. And although I've heard about elements of this, and I've obviously picked up on it just being in the culture that I'm in, to hear it all put together like that, it really paints a very stark image of how both society and the legal system seems to be stacked against men in this situation, and favouring women to, a degree that men should also be, they should receive the same amount of support as women.
You're talking about equality. That's
yes,
what you're talking about.
Pretty much, yeah.
It's a very simple concept. For me, it should not matter about gender in any way whatsoever. It should be about the victim in this. Now, I have to add a few caveats here that when you look at the research, you find that the most common form of domestic abuse is not extreme, and it's bi-directional. So this is a couple that maybe the media would label as a toxic relationship, where not necessarily at the same time, but there is abuse of some description, whether that's physical, coercive, whatever. That's part of their relationship. But the research also shows that the family inclusive research, and those are really the two camps that create this schism in the field. There's the feminist model and there's the family violence model. And the family violence model looks at all aspects of domestic abuse, where the feminist model positions domestic abuse as a patriarchal oppression, and it happens to women by men because they are women. And literally that is the strapline. You can find it on any website for what I call the big three: Respect, Refuge, and Women's Aid. Somewhere in there, it will have that as a quote. Domestic abuse is perpetrated on women by men because they are women, which in and of itself is very simplistic and stunts scientific curiosity. I would argue that it's dogma. It doesn't have any substance. It doesn't have any.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's almost, and again, you see this on social media, and I only smile because as soon as I tell anyone this, if you haven't spotted it already, you will. There are certain things that come out every single time you engage in any kind of gender-based debate on this. You will get this is patriarchy, it's patriarchy. I'm yet to get anyone to actually fully explain consistently what this patriarchy is. That women are oppressed, that domestic abuse is a reflection of societal norms about how women are oppressed, and that women do not commit abuse. It's either reactive abuse or because they are fearful of something that might or may not happen. So it's the dogma that comes through tends to be either that or 2 women a week are killed by a male partner. Now, yes, they are. It's actually slightly lower now, and they've changed it to 3 women a fortnight. Now, before I go any further, if there's been a reduction in homicides by male perpetrators and female victims because of something that we've done in society, hopefully driven by these organizations that profess to be working towards reducing domestic abuse, you think there'd be some kind of press release or shouting from the hilltops about we're doing something successful. The levels of murder of women is reducing. We never hear it. We never hear it at all. It's always more and more and more and more. And they find a way of manipulating the stats so it can remain 2 a week, to the point that they've extended it to 10 years of data that they're trying to average out rather than looking at the last 12 months. But so you see these patterns, and what they forget in that is that there's a study, and the Samaritans have kind of alluded to this, that out of the percentage of men that take their own lives each year, there's about 10 or 11% that is attributable to family issues and or domestic abuse. And that works out about 10 a week. So if we're going to set this up as a competition, which I detest, but if that's the vein they are taking, and we're saying 2 women a week, what about 10 men a week? Just because they've decided to take their lives themselves out of utter desperation doesn't mean they're any less dead. And that is the outcome of this. Yet it's brushed aside, or it's labelled, and I hate this, toxic masculinity. And again, I would argue that there's no such thing as toxic masculinity. There's toxic behaviours across the place. But also, they tend to frame toxic masculinity as men don't talk, men should open up, men should say this. My argument from my research and my findings is that men don't want to talk to a middle-aged woman about their deepest, darkest fears. And most counsellors and therapists are middle-aged women. They don't heal like that. A lot of women don't heal like that, but they tend to want to heal what we say shoulder to shoulder and active coping. And I know it sounds daft, but men's sheds, tinkering with a car, going for a walk up a mountain, sitting in the pub or playing pool in the pub. They might want to open up in that situation if they want to open up at all. But I'm sick and fed up of men, and male victims in particular, being treated like dysfunctional women. It's not toxic masculinity. We just don't have the healing processes that are applicable to men. We're the ones in the wrong, not them.
Yeah, it's unusual, really, that there are such well-established differences between men and women at the psychological level, but then when it comes to issues like that, they're almost thrown in together as if they're exactly the same. All of the nuances are lost, and I think if you actually ask someone more generally, well, how do men deal with negative emotions, which is perhaps less of an emotionally charged question, then they might give you an answer that's closer to the truth, in
Yes.
that they'll get on with other things and maybe bring it up, but they'll try and distract themselves rather than talk through it, which is something that is more typical of women, at least to my
Yes.
knowledge.
Well, I mean, you hit on something quite pertinent there when you said men are actually lumped in with women when it comes to this situation, because even as far as the Home Office is concerned, male victims from the Home Office and through the CPS are categorised and counted under the banner of violence against women and girls.
That's ridiculous.
It is.
I didn't know that.
Absolutely ridiculous. I'm not. There was a report that came out, and it said, again, this is not verbatim. I did put it out on Twitter. I was absolutely appalled, but kind of relieved that everyone else could see this. They produced a statement for male victims that's because of the hoo-ha that was created from the domestic abuse bill. And it said something along the lines of, it wasn't supporting men who are victims of crimes categorized under violence against women and girls. Essentially, it was saying men that were experienced crimes that are actually crimes that are against women and girls. And I thought to myself, how can you do that? How can we say we want men to come forward, yet tell them that the pain and suffering they've sustained isn't something that a man sustains? It's actually violence against women and girls. Talk about diminishing somebody and talk about emasculating somebody. Why the hell would you come forward and say, yeah, I've experienced what women and girls do? No one's going to do that.
Of course,
no one in the right mind. And then we kicked up a big stink, and they came back and changed the title to it. But actually, there was it was raised in the House of Lords a few weeks ago, and the Baroness that was dealing with this, the Domestic Abuse Act, I can't remember her name, Susan someone. She brought the act. She brought it to Parliament. She was asked, should various organisations, namely Men and Boys Coalition and Mankind Initiative, have really staunchly asked for a parallel violence against men and boys strategy. And another peer asked, can we do this? And her answer was, and this is on YouTube, I am really not making this up, was, yeah, I mean, I'm paraphrasing somewhat here.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah, we thought about that. But if we'd have done that, we think we'd have got complaints from women and the domestic abuse organisations that deal with women. And honestly, I can't even say the words that came out of my mouth at that point. But I was absolutely furious, because are you telling me that you denied, and according to our Office for National Statistics, 1 in 3 victims is a man. So you've denied a third of the government's own numbers because you're worried about complaints. Now, I did a sort of straw poll to my friends and colleagues and everything else that I know have experienced this, all women, and said, would it bother you in any way if there was a strategy to help male victims, men and boys that have been abused? No. Okay, here's my second question. In any way, does it diminish your experience as a woman if we support men and boys? No. So the only, again, from a very small, very quick 2-question poll, the only conclusion I can come to, again, based on all the research and all the literature for the past 5 decades, is that this racket is being protected by the organisations that get the funding. And it was them that would complain if there was a strategy, not only because they're worried about their funding, but again, because they have to come off their high horse and say, maybe this is not something that happens to women by men because they are women. Maybe there are other variables that are in place.
It undermines their practice, really, doesn't it, if you set up a parallel organisation? Because then if you have parity in how they're treated in politics, then these organisations are going to stick out like a sore thumb because they're not doing so.
Absolutely. And it's even beyond that, because then they would have to admit that all the money that they had for the last 50 years was based on a premise that does not exist. It doesn't exist. There was the head of Respect's perpetrator programs. Now, for those that don't know, Respect is the organization that accredits perpetrator programs for male perpetrators. Okay, so they are the ones that the government funds to any organization that wants to run a perpetrator program for male perpetrators. They have to follow Respect's guidelines. The terrifying thing is that the number 2 of their 10 principles clearly states that they believe domestic abuse is a gendered issue. And by gendered issue, it's they're committed against women by men because they're women. They also run the men's advice line, which is the advice line that's supposed to help male victims. So how does that marry up?
It doesn't seem to me.
No. It's very much poacher come gamekeeper to me. It's like, 2 days ago, their head of perpetrator services came out, and I was hopeful in the first sentence, said that we have to acknowledge male victims. And then she squashed it dead, because within 2 sentences, she said, because men, predominantly victims of other men, do need support. Now, again, sorry, that's bullshit. What they've done there is, if you look at violence outside of domestic abuse, violence on the streets, violence in general, men are predominantly victims, and yes, predominantly by male victims. But when you look inside the home, male victims are, to coin a phrase from them, overwhelmingly victims of women. Now, it says so in the ONS, where it shows those that have answered who the perpetrator is. For women, they say 58% of their perpetrators are men. Men say 61% of their perpetrators are women. So again, if we're setting up a competition, that's 1 to men. But I've also spoken to frontline service providers for male victims. And there's one in particular that's just really counted their data very, very well. And their data from last year showed that 94% of the men that use their services, and the group was 8,000, 94% of them were abused by women. So it's not true. And what's terrifying for me is that the head of the perpetrator services from the organization that also runs the men's advice line still labors the point that she believes male victims are victimized by other men, when it clearly isn't true.
It's staggeringly depressing in a way that we're not making any progress, even though we have all the information here to change our approach and to actually help people, that some stubborn-minded people can halt that purely because it upsets their reputation, it seems, and their funding as well. And
their mortgage. Don't forget. There's a lot of mortgages that rely on this particular phrase and this particular worldview. Now, that's not to say that the people on the front line, and again, I've benefited from these services. The people on the front line, the vast majority of them that I speak to that are helping women and are women focused, absolutely understand that men are victims, absolutely understand that some of the women that come to them are also engaged in this bi-directional abuse. They get it. And they don't have that real staunch view of the one I'm talking about. My issue is, I don't have a problem with anyone being gender focused in their organizations. If you're focused on women, great. If you're focused on men, great. If you're focused on children, great.
It does seem to be somewhat of a necessity, because the needs are different between the different groups, aren't they?
Absolutely. My issue comes when that then becomes a political lobby group to deny another set of victims. And that's where we are with these groups. And they sit on all the formative committees. We saw it with the domestic abuse review that was led by Jess Phillips, where all the female groups were invited to give evidence. Can't remember seeing one about male victims. They sit on a steering committee for the Office for National Statistics on how to measure coercive control. And the questions that were used there were very much centered on a female experience, because that's the data that they had. But there was one question that was about fear of losing children, losing the relationship with the children. And as you would expect, there was a huge skew towards men experiencing that. Guess what the committee did?
I imagine they probably ignored that latter point, didn't they?
They removed it as a question. So men
course.
don't even get asked that question anymore, because they said, oh no, it's far too skewed. Of course, that's going to be the way. It's not actual data. And it was removed. So even when questions are put in that would be applicable to men and male victims, if they don't follow the narrative, this steering committee gets it removed.
That's appalling. I mean,
so the deck is more than stacked.
Is there any way of things getting better? Do you see any indications that that might be the case?
Well, I think the genius for me of the Depp Heard case was that we all saw it. And it was like watching a car crash. There's no two ways about it.
One thing that oh sorry.
No, go ahead.
One thing that I was really taken aback by was the fact that towards the middle and the end of the case, the vast majority of people, both who I spoke to face to face and in the media and on social media, were saying, okay, well, it seems like Johnny Depp was actually right all along. And that kind of took me aback, because I expected it to at least be a bit more contentious than it was. And it really wasn't. And I was quite surprised by that pretty much everyone turned on Amber Heard after they saw the testimony. And
well, you don't need to be a psychologist to see what was happening in that room.
Of course, yeah.
We would obviously look at that from a sort of level of analysis, but anybody could see it. And that was one of the things I learned from my own personal case, and I'm probably sharing too much here, is when you're in that situation and you're battling for your own safety and that of your children, you can sometimes come across as sounding like the crazy person just by defending yourself, because some of the things that come out, and coercive control in particular, is really difficult to explain, because in isolated incidents, it's just a bit trivial or a bit normal, but it's actually underpinned by a network of abuse. But what we saw with the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case were things that are difficult to example, but actually in real life. And the example that springs to mind for me is literally, like I said, I was working on two screens, tapping away. And it was I don't know if you remember, it was the instance where Camille was asking Amber about the donations. And one of the things I do in my research, you might have seen it in that report, is I look at sentiment analysis and look for things that I call cognitive linguistic markers. And one of the things that abusers of that type do is they can change the whole meaning of language right in front of you. So you start questioning your own sanity and you think, did they mean that? Did I just take it out of context? Was it me that did that? Is it my fault? And that's what gaslighting is engineered to do. So literally sat here and it's happening. The donation thing is on. I'm tapping away, looking at some stuff. And Camille says, as of today, you have not donated £7 million to X and Y organisation. And Amber Heard says, this might not be verbatim, but I'm sure anyone can go and watch it. That's incorrect. And she turns to the jury and says, I pledged all £7 million. Now, that's not
a different
what she
claim,
was asked.
yeah.
And that is absolutely linguistic manipulation. So she was asked a question, you have not donated. Mm-hmm. She said, that's incorrect. We all know it's correct. We all know it's true. You didn't do that. And then she actually says, oh no, I pledged it all. And she gaslit the world, or she literally attempted to gaslight the world in that point. And she did exactly what these abusers do for everybody to see. Now, my fingers left my keyboard and I literally went, whoa, because I'm thinking, I'm going to use that when I'm lecturing as an example of what gaslighting looks like. But very rarely does anyone get to see that in action. Very rarely do you see outside of that intimate partnership what actually happens in real time. And we saw it. We saw the way she reacted. We saw the crying without the tears. We saw you could almost get a clapperboard when she was giving testimony. And as soon as Camille would say objection, she'd go from like that, it'd go cut, and she'd be absolutely fine. It was like watching someone act, not very well, but literally act.
I was surprised for an actress. She wasn't putting on the best performance, was she?
Not at all. And that's what we all saw. And I think the hope for me that went from a silver sliver and gradually became a chasm was that online, people that have identified as feminists for such a long time were coming out and saying, if we want equality, if this is what we claim we stand for, we have to acknowledge that she is an abuser and he is a victim. And I think it threw up a schism within what feminism is today, because you still had a couple of high profile feminists still claiming that it wasn't what we saw. And again, continuing the gaslighting, and that she's still a victim, an imperfect victim, and whatever phrase they were trying to use to dismiss her abusive behavior. But we all saw it. And on a Twitter account of mine, I had various people that I'd had horrible clashes with years ago actually message me and say, I'm sorry, you were right. You were right in what you said.
That's a rare thing to get as well, people apologising.
But I was gobsmacked, and I thought, what a courageous thing to do, to actually come back to someone that we'd gone at it fiercely and say, hands up, I get it. I get where you're coming from. This is not about excluding women. This is just about including men in the conversation. And there is space for all. And I am absolutely of the belief that if we do include everybody, and we include all the variables that we know contribute to domestic abuse, addiction, adverse childhood experiences, mental health, disorders, all of the above, then we can actually do something about it. And I think that's what's coming out now. I think this juggernaut is slowly being pushed round, slowly being turned, because we all saw it. We all saw it happen in real time.
So that is something promising, I suppose. And I mean, it is one of those things where it's, you don't even need that much knowledge of the background and the research. You can just see it and intuit what's going on without even having, a conscious idea of what you're looking for. I mean, I remember I went to visit my parents and we were watching the news with Amber Heard and Johnny Depp, and my mum immediately picked up on, oh, that doesn't seem genuine. This was exactly the scene of her supposedly crying.
Absolutely. And to be honest, the group of people that could judge that are women. We know each other very, very well. Women are the vast majority of the abuse I get online, and I'm talking 99% of the abuse I get online, is from other women, because they feel that my research somehow diminishes their experience, which is so far away from the truth. I can't even express it. But here we saw what a female abuser looks like. And she's beautiful, she's successful. Yet we were spun this narrative that, oh, it's patriarchy because everyone believes men, powerful men. Yet I clearly remember Me Too, believe women, believe her, so on and so forth. We've had an entire movement that has led us to the point that women can just say something and instantly we have to believe that.
That is a terrifying prospect for men. I know that when this was all going on, I was worried that at the drop of a hat, I could say something that someone doesn't like, and then they can accuse me of something that's incorrect, and I could go to prison potentially. And that power disparity is, terrifying, and everyone would believe them. No one would believe me, and that would be it.
Well, if we were in the same room, you would see I'm 5'1" and about 8 stone. I'm not a big person in any stretch of the imagination, but I've stood in a room where someone's challenged me, and I always welcome challenge, with the power of men compared to me. And I say, if we're talking about strength weight ratio, and you stick me in a boxing ring with any man, even a man of the same size as me, chances are he's going to win because of the strength weight ratio. But as far as power is concerned, I don't have to be in the same room as you to destroy your life. I can just pick up the phone and make an allegation of you saying something, or you threatening something, or me feeling uncomfortable about something. And that's you. I don't have to move a muscle to actually destroy your life. Now, that is a power disparity. Absolutely, that should not exist. It should not exist for anyone, because it can, and some people will exploit that. And we've seen it with the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case. We've seen it in real lifetime.
I think the thing that really sold it for me was that lots of Johnny Depp's former partners, who I think he's had a fair few, all came out and was just like, he's lovely, he's a gentleman. I mean, this is such glowing praise. I mean, very few people in the world can probably have such high praise from their former partners. And yet there are still people who, with this unlikely event happening, were completely willing to overlook that, this past judge of character.
Yeah, I saw, again, something on social media where an influential barrister in this field said, you don't need to have a pattern of abuse. It just needs to happen once. Now, that's not what the literature says, to be fair. But again, from my research experience, I've worked with a lot of different organizations through the CPS, and I've got friends in various organizations. And I remember one friend contacting me and saying that she was dealing with the female of this partnership, and a colleague of hers was dealing with the man, and they'd both been arrested for various different things. At this point, not domestic abuse. They were actually involved in various criminality. But then weeks later, he'd been arrested and taken to the police station for abuse. What's gone on here was the question. So, of course, I'm digging in and I said, okay, can you tell me a bit more background? And the background was that the woman in this partnership had come from a family where the father was abusing the mother, but she was very close with her dad. And that's her dad was, I don't know what you would call it, a professional criminal or a lifelong criminal in quite heavily. And she'd gone along with him. And that's how she'd managed to go throughout her life. But she was abusive. She'd had partners that were abusive all the way through her life, because she'd obviously seen that in her home. She'd obviously experienced that. There's a lot of violence going on, a lot of abuse going on. She'd met this guy who had never had a history of abuse, never as a criminal or as just a bloke, never had a history of abuse, but then was arrested and charged with domestic abuse. and he was the perpetrator and it was all about him. But actually, it transpired that she was kicking the heck out of him on a daily basis. He'd reacted by shoving her away and pushing her over, and then she'd phone the police, and of course he gets arrested. So sometimes a man out of the blue, and a woman in these situations, can become a perpetrator because they've just been pushed to the nth degree. I understand that, but you have to look at history. If you discount history, in psychology and life in general, an indicator of future behavior is past behavior.
Absolutely, yeah.
And if all his partners, not just one or two, all of them said, no, he's absolutely fine. He's lovely, in fact. I think Vanessa Paradis said, we co-parent brilliantly. We still go on holidays together. And then I think the genius as well in the case was when they got Kate Moss in. And she just completely dismissed that whole notion of being pushed down the stairs. But yes, you're right. All of his partners came forward and said, no way, ever, never happened, would never happen. Everyone he's worked with came forward and said that. Yet we had the completely opposite side on Amber's side, yet that seems to not matter.
Didn't she even have some of her own family members saying that she's manipulative and things of that nature? I think
it was the parents, wasn't it? The parents texting Johnny Depp or something that said that. But yeah, it's the whole case was incredible, and I think it really needed. I don't want anyone to be victimized in any way, but the fact that Johnny Depp was, and he did something about it, albeit 6 years on, he really has been through some stuff in those past 6 years, as far as his life being destroyed. But to come back from this, I think, has not just given men hope. I completely disagree that it dismisses women and stops female victims coming forward, because what it does show is evidence can actually produce justice.
It's a nice realization, because it seems like in this area it's been pretty poor previously, at the very least.
Absolutely. And I think some of the organizations that are railing against this, and I would go so far to say are peddling fear to female victims, are doing so because they can't get away with just putting in a non-molestation order now. They can't just keep getting away with saying, well, she's a woman, believe her, and destroying a man's life and children's lives because of that. We should rely on evidence. And yes, it can be really difficult to evidence stuff, but evidence can come in all sorts of forms. It can come in the forms of keeping a journal. It can come in the forms of talking to a friend. We've seen that it can come in the forms of text messages to a friend. There's various ways that you can gather evidence in order to put your case across. And if I was a man who was falsely accused of these things, I'd be really tempted to say, okay, if you're accusing me of something that is criminal, I'd like this to be tried in a criminal court, because then it's not based on the balance of probabilities. It's based on a much higher evidential basis. So rather than you just be tried in a family court where it doesn't matter, we're just going to take it as, well, that's the truth. Actually take it to a criminal court and see if it can be tried on robust evidence.
I think that's quite a good recommendation for any men that are suffering from these sorts of forms of domestic abuse. And I think that's definitely what men need, because I don't think this kind of thing really gets talked about very much. And I certainly wasn't as aware of this sort of thing and the avenues you could take if you did face these problems. And it's always very clear the pathways women can take, because you could probably ask anyone on the street and they'd be able to tell you what they could do in that scenario without doing any research prior, or whereas it would take a lot to find out what to do as a man. And I think that this is some great stuff. It seems like there is some sort of parity in how we treat victims of this kind of abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's telling that we've had many national campaigns to raise awareness for female victims, national TV campaigns, social media campaigns. We've not had one for male victims. Yet the government's own numbers, even with all the manipulation of the questions that I've said, even with, we know that men don't recognise they're being domestically abused, because we have normalised it. We say that men are henpecked or under the thumb, or, you know, kept on a tight leash or whatever. We have normalised coercive control in those particular arenas. So often men don't even recognise that they're being abused. And then when they do, it's categorised under violence against women and girls. So why would you even go forward? And where do you go? The men's advice line is run by an organisation that A, is of the belief that this is a gendered crime, and B, the head of the Perpetrator services thinks that you can only be victimised as a man by another man. So where are you going to go with this? But even with all this information of the government's own numbers, there's not been one call for a campaign. Not one of the organisations that take up millions of pounds of public money, taxpayers' money, not one of them said, should we have a campaign for men? Yeah, if Respect is running the men's advice line, why are they not lobbying to have a national campaign to raise awareness for male victims?
I mean, even if it was purely about the money, you would imagine that they probably want to expand their influence and, you know, encompass a wider church of people, because that way they can have a larger organisation. So it's clearly ideologically motivated, because it's actually detrimental if they're looking at it purely economically to their business's survival. Or charities. I'm calling it a business. That's a bit of a Freudian slip there.
Having come from industry, I would argue in agreement with you that this is an industry. Mm-hmm. This is an industry that is a closed shop, because even in the organisations for female victims, they don't employ any men. Now, I'm not just saying men in the frontline services that deal with female victims on a daily face-to-face basis. I'm talking someone in the mailroom, someone in the marketing department that never actually comes face-to-face with a female victim. It's all women. Now, that's not equality. B, that's not what that exemption was put in the Equalities Act for. Mm-hmm. That was just for face-to-face female victims. Although, again, I would argue by not having any men in the room just perpetuates the fear of men that they so gladly feed all the time.
Well, yeah, the best way to reduce fear is to confront the fear, isn't it? And if you have someone who's, say, a trained professional, you know they're not going to be threatening, you can rationalise it that way, even if you have that sort of unconsciously programmed fear, then that exposure is actually going to help de-escalate that fear and allow them to return to some form of normality, I would imagine, at least.
Well, yeah, because strangely enough, in normality, 49% of the population are men. So they're going to go to the shops and see men. They're going to get on a bus and see men. You know, they might even have boys as children. What are we perpetuating here? It doesn't feel healthy in any way. But
no, it doesn't sound it.
No, but the whole system is set up. And sometimes I think, am I a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist here? But I really am not. This is literally out there. Anyone can find all the information and all the policy documents and everything else. But it is set up so far against men that I worry for my son and my stepsons. I'm terrified. They're teenagers. They're going to be dating. What's going to happen if someone makes a false allegation against them? Where do they go? who supports them?
Well, hopefully things are going to be turning around after that very public Heard versus Depp case, and I think that that's given everyone a very salient example in their minds, even if they're not too familiar with what's going on behind the scenes, of, okay, well, actually, she was an abuser, and being able to just have something come to mind and be able to point to it is a really good first step in going in the right direction, in my opinion. But
without doubt.
I think we're slowly running out of time, so if there's anything you would like to say before wrapping up.
I would just like to reiterate that I do think things are changing.
Mm-hmm.
There are more and more academics that are really pushing the research on this. It really is it's quite a large and growing body of evidence that we have for this. I also think that the barriers between the two groups, the schism in the field, is in some areas is decreasing. And I work with academics that take a feminist perspective on this and follow the feminist model. But we produce reports together. We produce reports that talk about female victims from their perspective, and it also includes male victims from my perspective. So again, I have no issue in people believing that certain groups need to be centered. My only issue comes when they try to deny another set of victims. But hopefully the Depp Heard cases really push this out there to the public. And more people will do things like this, have conversations like this, where it's out there for everyone to see.
Mm-hmm. That's what I'm hoping for anyway.
Yeah, and they can quite clearly see that the evidence is available.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you very much for speaking to me, and thank you very much for the work you do as well. It's a very admirable cause. And thank you for talking to us.